every church I think I've ever worked in, and each one has its characteristics. You know, in the South, by the fifth verse, actually probably by the third verse, everyone had their hands in the air and be waving back and forth. Some places people would clap. Sometimes we would sing it unaccompanied. I have memories even in our own church of when we were gathering for worship, when we would sing it in a circle at the end of services. But its fundamental message is really at the heart of what I wanted to emphasize today. Grace, grace, grace. Generous, unbounded love. God's love for us, even when we can't muster that love for each other. God's generous, extravagant love for us. Now, we're gathering in the middle of the Jewish holy days, Rosh Hashanah, last Friday night, the beginning of the year 5,781. Tradition says that's 5,781 years since the beginning of creation. Someone must have been keeping a diary. But we understand it to be a symbolic number, of course. And then several days later, next week, will be Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So Rosh Hashanah is a day of great joy. It's a new year. If you saw the graphics that went out in the email, Nancy asked me, and by the way, Nancy is doing a fantastic job working with Buchiko on the newsletter right now. I hope you'll be sure to thank both of them. But there were pictures of apples and honey, because that's one of the traditional foods, the sweetness of the new year. Apples and honey are served when people say L'Shana Tova, Happy New Year. It's a great joy to know that we can begin again. At the same time, a week later, Jews from around the world will be gathering, or they'll be gathering in their homes for the first time ever in the modern era, not gathering in groups, just like we will probably be doing on Christmas Eve in our homes and not in church, for a holy day of remembering what it is that we've done wrong. Now, we do this on Ash Wednesday, but we do it for like an hour. In Judaism, they do it for the whole day, and they don't eat till it's done. It's a long service because sometimes it takes a whole day to think about what it is we want to change about our lives. Knowing that we can change, we actually can change. So in the days in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, these sacred holy days, they're called the days of awe, A-W-E. It's a great old-fashioned word, awe. It's not meant to invoke terror, but appreciation. When we see something or we experience something that just, it takes our breath away. It's so powerful. Awe, appreciation, awareness, being awakened to, intentionality, all that is going on around us. And they say, Judaism is not a religion that believes in the afterlife. One's own life is the testimony by which we are remembered. It's not motivated by a reward in the life to come. It's a difference with Christianity, but where we believe in a life to come. But in Judaism, these days of awe are mystical days, and anything can happen. If you can imagine it, it can happen. And we saw that yesterday when 20 individual screens, 21, 22 people, I'm not exactly sure how many, gathered for 2 hours for a retreat. It wasn't a business meeting. It was just a time out to imagine, to dream. It was our own 2 hours of awe in which anything is possible. And it spurred us on to think about not only what have we learned in the last 6 months during this seemingly endless COVID time, but what is it that we want to apply to our future? What is it we want to dream into living? What kind of world do we want it to be? What role do we want our own lives to play in that? Also our church. So these are the days of awe, and we're experiencing them together. Now, I want to say this about why do we even acknowledge these days? in Christian worship. And that's because I think Christians need to be reminded from time to time that our religion springs out of Judaism. There would be no Christianity without Judaism. In the same way that this is a very, very, very broad, unnuanced historical statement, but there's a truth in it. Buddhism is a reform movement of Hinduism. It made it possible for the teachings of Hinduism to spread into other parts of the world and become indigenized there and called Buddhism. Christianity is a way that Judaism became a world religion, but it has its deep roots in Judaism. You can't really fully grasp half or 3/4 of what Jesus is talking about if we do not acknowledge and at times dig into what the original Jewish meaning of it was. I think every time, particularly during Holy Week, it's important for us to do this because Christians have perpetuated a lot of anti-Semitism then, still, and it's important for us from time to time to acknowledge that this is our dishonoring of our Jewish roots, and we have to repent of it. Part of what we repent of during these days of awe as Christians is the perpetuation, conscious or unconscious, theologically, politically, socially, of even the slightest whiff of anti-Semitism. What is it about religious people that we sometimes derive the value of what we believe at the expense of demeaning what others believe? This is not true to the life of Jesus, but it is a characteristic sometimes of Christians and other religions. So that's why we're acknowledging these days of awe, because we're trying to put ourselves a little bit into the rhythm of Jesus's mindset. These are the holidays that Jesus observed. They observed them differently. There were different customs, but still the notion of a new year, a new beginning, once a year, a time of celebration, and also the need once a year, at least, to take a personal moral inventory and say, this has got to change, and I want to change. And I believe that with God's help and the help of the community, I can change. So those two rhythms are important to our own Christian spirituality. And that's why we acknowledge them in our worship today. We're not co-opting them, we're not doing them as Jews, but we do say thank you to our Jewish friends and neighbors and ancestors who have made our faith possible, everything that we hold sacred and dear. So that's all background to this story that Jesus tells that I think can be useful for us as part of taking our own inventory and thinking about what is it that we want to change about ourselves and our life together as we live out our lives in community. So there's a series of parables right now in Matthew's gospel that we're working through. And I told you last week that we did one of them. That was a hard one, in which Jesus says you have to forgive 490 times. And I respectfully disagreed with him. One of my Episcopalian priest friends, a professor of theology, who's now pastor of a church in Michigan, took me to task for saying that I disagreed with Jesus, but who listened to my sermon and was like, what? You can't say that. But you know, I believe that Jesus was a teacher. And we've got a lot of people who have been teachers, and I've been a teacher in this group. Teaching isn't about telling people what to believe or how to think. Good teachers present learning opportunities in which we even question the teacher and the teaching in order to come to our own moral and ethical decisions. That's what solid Bible teaching is, I think. It doesn't tell you what to believe. It shows you how to make your own decisions and to interpret them. So I say this with respect. Last week, I still disagreed that unless there is true repentance or an acknowledgement on the part of the person who is sinning against others, and I was talking about racism in particular, to just forgive doesn't make sense. It can become license for a person to repeatedly engage in unrighteous acts. there is value in hearing the words of Jesus, forgive, forgive, forgive. This week, though, it's an easier one, thank God, because I didn't want to disagree with Jesus 2 weeks in a row. That seemed like a little much. And the commentaries, all the commentaries that ministers are taught to use on this passage says, okay, you got a break this week because this one's easy, but don't be too heavy-handed just because it's easier to see probably what Jesus was talking about. Let me remind you about something about a parable. A parable is a story, and it's a way for us to understand what God was saying then and what God is speaking still to us. In a parable, regardless of how it's presented to us, we are invited to try on being all of the characters, right? You read it from one perspective and say, well, I identify with the landowner here. Or another perspective, you might say, there have been times in my life when I identify with the person who works all day faithfully. Then somebody else comes along and only works for an hour, and they get the same recognition. Elizabeth and I went back and forth on this because she has a strongly evolved sense of fairness. And she was tending to agree with the 9 o'clock in the morning people. I'm not meaning to call you out, Elizabeth, but it's just true. We talked about it quite a bit yesterday. Or there are times in our lives, so in reading this story, which I'll summarize for us again in a moment, we might identify with the person who comes late in the day, desperate for work, grateful to have had even an hour's work, and then are surprised to receive full recognition. It's not a perfect analogy, and it's not meant to be comprehensive in every aspect, but I do think it can teach us something about the generosity of God and God's love for all people. So it starts out, there's this vineyard owner, householder, and I just remind us again, these first century stories, I believe that God speaks through them, through divine inspiration, but they are tied to a particular time and place. The word for householder is despot, right? A person who had a lot and didn't really have to think about the consequences of that on others. So all the more remarkably, we call this the story of the vineyard laborers in the vineyard, but it could be the story of the remarkable, fair-minded, justice-oriented employer. But he goes out early to hire laborers for the vineyard. It's harvest time, so time is of the essence. And he finds some, and they agree on a particular sum. And the sum that's agreed upon, it's not quantified in our modern terms, but it's a fair day's wage. It's not meant to communicate that they were being exploited. It's not meant to communicate that they were working on a co-op with profit sharing either, but they did get a fair day's wage. That's good. And then as the day progresses, as the householder becomes anxious that maybe we're not going to finish in time for the harvest, he keeps going out and looking for people at the 3rd hour, the 5th hour, the 9th hour, I mean, just several times throughout the day. And each time he says to them, just come and you'll receive what's fair. So at the end of the day, he even asks the one late in the day, well, how come you aren't working? And they say, because no one asked us to work. It's a reminder to us that there is no fair system, really, that every time people try to apply certain standards and say, well, this person, they were lazy, they weren't working. There are other larger systems at work that make even fair employment difficult, if not impossible. So that's acknowledged in the story. No one asked, no one gave me the opportunity. Still, at the end of the day, the householder says, all right, bring everybody together and I'm going to pay them. And he pays the last workers, he pays in front of everyone, the same, a full day's wage. And some of the people who got there early were thinking, oh, well, if they get a full day for just working for an hour, maybe we ought to get even more, even though they'd agreed to work for the full, fair 1 day's wage. And then things sort of melt down. They're angry. They say to the householder, well, that's just not fair. We were here first. We were faithful. We did everything the right way. We followed the systems and procedures. And now these other people, they came late. They don't know our ways. They're different. And they're getting the same equal, fair day's wage, as if they should be punished somehow, with no acknowledgement that it wasn't even possible for some of them to work the full day because they didn't have the opportunity. And that's where the householder calls them to account. It says, take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last as I gave to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So, and then Jesus says that thing, the last will be first, the first last. Jesus casts a story here, or a vision of a different world than the one people are living in. It's not one where everyone is treated fairly and justly, where systems, unequal systems of oppression are acknowledged, and where there's restitution and remedy for them. He casts a vision of a world where everybody has what they need. This is where the commentaries say, now preachers, be careful. Don't get real heavy-handed here. But I think it's fairly clear that this is really Jesus's heart. Everybody should have what they need. I heard a Jesuit, James Martin, who I like to listen to, talk about in regard to this passage, that they have a saying among the Jesuits. I don't know if it's true or not. Compare and despair. If you try to look at what others get and have that be a determinant of whether or not you're valued in the same way, and you're the person who is clearly the privileged one, you will despair. Don't compare. Hope for, work for everyone receiving what is their just due. Okay, so what does that mean for us? You know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's legacy, the woman who graduated from my alma mater, I'm happy to say, and couldn't get a clerkship despite being a distinguished scholar because she was a woman and because she was Jewish. Both of those things worked against her. And yet, at some point, she's given a break. And look what her contribution has been. Every essential court case over her tenure that involved valuing the human rights of women, of gay people, of immigrants, came from her study, and everyone agrees she was a scholar, but also from her life experience. And she too was part of casting a vision of a world that, as she reminded the people who questioned her when she was qualified to be, when they were choosing her or confirming her as a Supreme Court justice, the Constitution that she's upholding did not envision women as people, slaves as people, only white male landowners. And that was then, this is now. But we have to be willing to take stock and say, without resentment, in order for everyone to receive what they deserve. And they deserve it because they're human beings. It's not about virtue, right? Good people, bad people. This is a Christian way of thinking sometimes. That's not what Jesus cares about. He cares about people receiving what they deserve because they're human beings. Good people, bad people, doesn't matter. And I also think that this way of thinking needs to be brought to bear right now for us in our awareness of what's happening about immigration. Two things happened this week that I just want to be sure we noted. The Trump administration wanted, and I'm sorry to, I'd really try to be careful not to name the person of the president because I believe it's about a system. So I apologize for that. Our current administration has sued to end what's called temporary protective status, TPS. Now, some of you may know about this, some of you may be experiencing it right now. I was very aware of this in Boston, where I had a number of Haitian friends and where Haitian members of our church also. It means that over the last, say, 30 years, 40 years, some groups of people have been granted, because of dangerous circumstances in their own country, what's called temporary protective service status. 400,000 right now, and they have had 200,000 children who are living now as citizens in the U.S. They are about to be subject to immediate deportation. Many of them own homes and businesses. These are not the immigrants who came through the southern border. These are people who came at the behest of our government, mostly Haitian, Salvadoran, Nicaraguan, from the Sudan also, a few other places. But they're about to be deported, 400,000. And people say, well, they didn't come the right way. Well, they did come. They came at our government's invitation, and circumstances have not changed in some of the countries where they came from. Just this week, the Salvadoran general who ordered the murder of the priests and their housekeeper and her teenage daughter was brought to justice in a Spanish court. That murder took place in 1989. I've been to the site of the murder in University of Central America in San Salvador. It's the saddest, most painful place in the world. There's just a little rock that marks where the housekeeper and her daughter were killed. It took till this year for that general to be brought to justice. And he was trained in the United States, and the soldiers were they're weaponized by the United States. We paid for that. We collectively paid for that. We owe something to the people of El Salvador, to the people of Haiti, to some of these other countries. Because they came later, they didn't come the right way, doesn't matter. They deserve dignity, respect, and a fair treatment. The other situation I want to lift up around immigrants, because I think a lot of what drives our anti-immigrant bias when it's manifest, and this is true in my own family, I'm pained to say, where I had 4 grandparents from different countries, none of whom had papers. Okay, that's not how it was done when they came here. I mean, some did, but not my family. Okay, and my family members, I'm ashamed to say, all say the same thing. Well, these people who are here in this country, they didn't come the right way. They need to follow the process, even though there is no process. It's resentment, and it's inhumane, and it's a lack of empathy and compassion. And I say this, I'm including myself in it, okay? In that system, at least. So when Dawn Wooten, she's my new hero, she's a nurse at the Irwin Correctional Facility in a town in Georgia, I forget the name of it, Asilla, where there is a privately run ICE prison. So a lot of our ICE detention centers are run as businesses, profitable businesses. And she's filed a whistleblower complaint this week saying that in this facility, COVID protections are not taking place. It's a women's facility. She described what she witnessed as a nurse that she could no longer witness. And then she said, additionally, women are being experimented on and their uteruses are being removed in enforced hysterectomies. I'm sure if you didn't see this article or these stories this week, look them up. I just read yesterday the 25-page whistleblower report. It's enough. It would chill you to the bone. These things are happening, and they're being justified by an unjust system, and the very kind of system Jesus challenges us about in this gospel passage. So here's my invitation. Let's use these days of awe personally, collectively as a church, also as a nation, to re-examine our prejudices and our biases. And let's commit to atone for them and to live a new beginning with an awareness that not all is equal for everyone. This is what Jesus is calling us to in very clear terms here. So I invite you, go back and look at the story, look for interviews with Dawn Wooten, W-O-O-T-E-N, in the news, and most importantly, to be open to these words of Jesus. The first shall be last and the last first. And you know that for Jesus and God, we are all the first. There's no last. Every single one of us are loved equally, abundantly, unconditionally, and empowered by that. There's nothing we can't do. I'm going to close with this quote from the play Love, Valor, Compassion by Terrence McNally. It's a playwright who died earlier this year of COVID. He has many more famous plays, but this is one I like about where he talks about God. Do you believe in God? Do you? I think we all believe in God in our way, or want to, or need to. Only so many of us are afraid to. Unconditional love is pretty terrifying. We don't think we deserve it. It's human nature to run from it. But God always finds us. God never gives up. I used to think that's what other people were for. Lovers, friends, family. I had it all wrong. Other people are imperfect and as frightened as we are. We love, but not unconditionally. Only God is unconditional love. And we don't even have to love God back. God's very big about it. I have a lot of reservations about God. What intelligent, caring person doesn't lately? But the way I see it, God doesn't have any reservations about me. It's very one-sided. It's unconditional. Besides, God is God, and I'm not. Beloved, we are all the first in God's light. And let's treat each other in the very same way. Amen.